Hi, thank you, Megan, for that generous introduction. Thank you all for coming. I have the pleasure of introducing Justin Leroy tonight. Justin Leroy is a historian of the 19th century United States with a particular interest in slavery and abolition, Black political thought, and the history of capitalism. Justin is assistant professor of history at the University of California, Davis. He received his PhD at New York University, and before joining the faculty at UC Davis, he was a postdoctoral fellow in Global American Studies at Harvard University. Justin's first book, Freedom's Limit, Slavery and Its Afterlives in the Long 19th Century, will be published in the History of U.S. Capitalism series at Columbia University Press. His talk today draws from an article co-authored with Zenia Kish titled Bonded Life, Technologies of Racial Finance, From Slave Insurance to Philanthrocapital, which appeared in the journal Cultural Studies in 2015. I read this essay, Bonded Life, a year ago. At the time, I had been working on a project that addressed the extent of slave insurance. The clarity with which their text approaches the complexity of social impact bonds conveys what is at stake in these arrangements. As they write, poor people and those with various social needs are seen as expensive for the state to the extent that they use government resources and programs. To transform these populations from public costs into assets, they are recast by philanthrocapitalists, not as customers or as human capital, as presumed by some critiques of neoliberalism, but as potential investments that can pay future dividends. Not only does their text consider the vast potential implications of social impact bonds, but it situates them within a lineage of racial capitalist instruments. I believe this historical context is necessary to develop an understanding of how such instruments have come to be. I'm honored that Justin has agreed to speak tonight, so please join me in welcoming him.
Thank you all so much for being here, and thanks especially to Cameron for inviting me to speak, and to Megan and Emma for coordinating this event. And it's wonderful to see so many familiar faces in the audience. Again, the title for my talk is Race, Finance, and the Afterlife of Slavery. And I'll be speaking about the recent rise of what's being called social finance, or ethical investing. Much of this talk is drawn from an article I co-authored with my close colleague Zenia Kish, and Zenia is currently a research fellow at Stanford, and she's an expert on social finance both in the US and in West Africa. So if you're interested in the contemporary dimensions of this talk more than the historical ones, I really encourage you to seek out her work and even reach out to her. In choosing to link disparate moments in the history of finance, I'm not going to claim that financial practices in the slave economy are direct antecedents to the financial practices of ethical investing. What I am claiming, however, is that by examining seemingly unrelated modes of investment, we can see that racialized life has repeatedly served as the basis for development of new modes and new methods to assess and augment the future value of particular lives. In the 18th and 19th centuries, finance instrumentalized Black life through the extension of maritime insurance, credit, bill discounting, and bonds that multiplied the value of slaves beyond the immediate productivity of their labor. Similarly, contemporary financial innovations target highly racialized issues such as prison recidivism, teen pregnancy, and homelessness, incorporating these populations into the market by making them targets for private investment. By thinking about social finance within a longer, intersecting history of race and finance, we can see that racial difference has been a driving force behind making human life an object of investment across historical periods. But before we begin, I'd just like to say a few words about how I, as a 19th century historian, became so concerned with these 21st century financial innovations. As Cameron mentioned, I'm currently working on a book in which I'm trying to unmoor popular and scholarly assumptions about the oppositional relationship between slavery and freedom. These things seem to be complete opposites. But I argue that each emancipatory moment in the 19th century British Atlantic world, from the US North to the British West Indies to the US South, was premised on a form of freedom that transformed the primary vehicle for Black subjugation from a relationship between capitalism and slavery into one between capitalism and freedom. And I'm interested not just in the limits of freedom, but particularly how Black writers and thinkers challenged those limits over the course of the 19th century. Because despite a prominent turn to capitalism in the study of slavery, scholarly work on early Black political thought remains largely invested in questions centered on rights, citizenship, and formal equality. Such questions obscure the way in which emancipation strengthened the ideological underpinnings of capitalism, for a nation without slaves could claim moral authority even as it enacted racial and economic policy that rendered legal freedom much less significant than it otherwise might have been. The transition from slavery to freedom is so deeply suffused with a sense of historical and moral progress that it can be difficult to meaningfully critique that transition without opening ourselves to thinking about history in entirely new ways. If I were to ask you how the legacy of slavery reaches into the present, we'd probably talk about economic inequality, notions of Black criminality and disparate incarceration rates, and violence committed with impunity against Black people. And we might eventually conclude that slavery was an institution so horrific and so immense that of course we would still be dealing with these lingering traces more than a century and a half later. Things are still really bad, but they've gotten better over time and will continue to do so. The best example of this way of thinking is perhaps when Martin Luther King Jr. paraphrased the abolitionist Theodore Parker and said, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice." I have to admit, I'm increasingly dissatisfied with this way of thinking. Why are we so quick to assume that history always conforms to a simple model of forward progress? Why do we always assume contemporary racial violence is merely a remnant of the much greater violence of an earlier historical moment? What if instead the present is sometimes an amplification of the past rather than its echo? I realize that all of this might sound quite hyperbolic. After all, what could possibly be worse than slavery? So it's important to say here that I'm not trying to produce shock value or just to be contrarian. I'm actually building on the ways that 19th century Black writers theorized the relationship between slavery and what came after. So I'd like to share something I came across in my research that's really transformed my thinking on these questions. This is an 1864 newspaper editorial by a free Black man named James Mccune Smith. Smith was an abolitionist and the first Black American physician, and he was actually educated not too far from here in what's now the Lower East Side. At the height of the Civil War, he wrote, "There is no political, religious, or philanthropic agency at work that can encompass the entire abolition of slavery. In slave society, labor lies prostrate, and capital dictates its own terms, which are perpetual subjugation, in other words, perpetual slavery. Far from this war diminishing the wish or power of capital to own labor, it will increase both. Colossal monopolies are parceling out even the free states for their ownership. The slave in the South will have namesakes in fact, if not in title, north of the Mason-Dixon line." In other words, Smith was arguing that under the domination of capital, emancipation would mean the contraction of Black freedom rather than its fulfillment. Smith is gesturing toward what we might call the afterlife of slavery. At its most straightforward, the afterlife of slavery can be the perpetuation of slave-like conditions after the formal end of slavery. So for example, in 1894, 3 decades after emancipation, Frederick Douglass remarked, "The Negro is, in certain localities, in a worse condition today than in the time of slavery. It comes of the determination of slavery to perpetuate itself, if not under one form, then under another. It is due to the folly of endeavoring to put the new wine of liberty in the old bottle of slavery." So Douglass, of course, was referring to lynching and other forms of racial violence that happened all across the South and the nation after the end of Reconstruction. But more importantly, I think we can frame the afterlife, the concept of the afterlife, as an interruption of progressive historical time. Things are supposed to live and then die, and if they live again or don't quite die, it distorts our sense of proper sequence. The concept of an afterlife forces us to think differently and counterintuitively about the relationship between past and present, and slavery and freedom. So with that in mind, let's turn to the present. In the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis, a new economic discourse emerged. The purpose of that discourse, called social finance, social entrepreneurship, conscious capitalism, or philanthrocapitalism, was to recuperate the forces of capitalism for social causes. With mottos like doing well while doing good, proponents of social finance have devised new ways to make money while promising at the same time to benefit society. Actors in this new moral economy see their expanding business interests as filling gaps left by the receding public sector. But as we'll see later on, they're curiously silent on how those same business interests might contribute to the contraction of the public sector they then seek to ameliorate. From green technology or education startups to philanthropic organizations, the social finance sector is driven by self-proclaimed ethical venture capitalists, charitable foundations, and NGOs that propose responsible investing as an alternative to the recklessness or even sociopathy of Wall Street. They also pose themselves in contradistinction to inefficient government programs and disavowing the role of corporate and financial power in producing the conditions of inequality they wish to solve. These various philanthrocapitalists operate under the belief that everyone benefits when financial and social goals are blended into responsible investments. Such investments simultaneously promote new funding streams for social services while expanding capital-generating possibilities for ethical financiers. So philanthrocapitalists are proposing new ways of solving social problems, but just as important, they're also proposing a radical redefinition of the relationship between the state, the market, and vulnerable populations by reimagining the public sector as accountable to investors as well as to ordinary citizens. And it's important to remember that although proponents of this kind of investing think of themselves as very socially conscious individuals, they still see government primarily as an obstacle rather than an enabler of large-scale social change. By restructuring the public sector according to the logic of finance culture, they hope to bring innovation and efficiency to government programs they see as hopelessly bogged down with bureaucratic inertia. Such restructuring is supposed to be a win-win. It offers solutions to big social problems while at the same time reinvigorating capitalism's moral authority at a moment when that authority is particularly vulnerable. The piece of social finance that interests me most is the newly developed social impact bond. Social impact bonds, or SIBs, are less than a decade old, and they're an especially clear demonstration of how the logic of social finance gets put into action. While the details vary from project to project, essentially an SIB is a bond with a fixed term but a variable rate of return. A government entity issues the bond to private investors in order to raise money to address a social problem. The investor then contracts out the design and implementation of a solution to address said social problem to another organization, usually a nonprofit service provider. The purpose of SIBs is to outsource the initial cost and risk of funding around these kinds of social issues to private investors. If the program they come up with meets its goals by a set date, investors are repaid the upfront capital they invested and receive guaranteed returns that range from usually 6 to 13% per year. And these goals usually include reducing government spending as well as achieving specific social outcomes. SIBs don't directly privatize public programs. They preserve public jurisdiction over targeted services, but innovate ways of making government pay returns to private investors for services that it already provides. Proponents of social impact bonds operate under the premise that governments are ineffective, wasteful, and resistant to change. They offer private investments as a way of funding expensive social services and frame investors as empowered by taking the risks necessary to bring about social change, as opposed to risk-averse public servants. All of that probably sounds a little bit abstract, so let me give an example. In 2010, an organization called Social Finance UK instituted the first SIB in Peterborough, England, with the goal of reducing prison recidivism among young men by 7.5% over 7 years. The Ministry of Justice solicited private investments in the amount of £5 million. Social Finance UK then contracted out services to provide healthcare, employment training, and substance abuse counseling to youth at risk of reoffending. This SIB has been successful so far, and in 2016, they announced a recidivism reduction of 8.5%. Several other SIBs have been modeled on the Peterborough project, including one right here in New York City, working with former inmates at Rikers Island, funded by Goldman and Bloomberg. And that bond has not been a success. In offering a critique of SIBs and other forms of social finance, I'm not trying to say that they can't make a positive difference in the life of any given individual. But I am very concerned about the ways in which social finance asks us to change our understanding of what constitutes a public good. The CEO of Social Finance US, an offshoot of the UK group, has claimed that social impact bonds are rewriting the social contract between civil society and government through the intermediation of the private sector. But we just elected a president who ran on a similar premise, that business leaders know best how to fix a broken country. And in fact, just a couple of days ago, Trump named Jared Kushner head of the new Office of American Innovation, whose purpose is to apply business strategies to federal operations. Kushner said, "The government should be run like a great American company. Our hope is that we can achieve successes and efficiencies for our customers, who are the citizens." So while I don't want to completely dismiss the successes of social impact bonds, I do want to question their underlying logic. In order to market SIBs as profitable investment opportunities, governments, the nonprofits they contract, and groups like social finance must redefine social benefits according to economic rationalities. Such a redefinition involves turning social problems into investable opportunities by monetizing the benefits of tackling social problems. This means, first and foremost, that social services associated with SIBs need to reduce state operating costs, increase efficiency, and demonstrate measurable, benchmarked social returns. Furthermore, tackling social problems becomes a risk rather than a responsibility, and by taking this risk, investors then become entitled to their financial rewards. This type of thinking accelerates the privatization of public services and makes such services accountable to stakeholders and investors rather than the marginalized or the public writ large. One of the things that often goes unremarked upon in discussions of social finance is the fact that financial innovation has historically been and continues to be deeply racialized. If we're talking about prison recidivism in the UK and especially in the US, we're talking about people of color. In fact, I'd go so far as to say that it's impossible to think about the development of financial practices without recognizing the long and intertwined history of race and finance. Specifically, finance has historically developed new innovations by experimenting upon racialized bodies and making these populations investable. Making life itself more productive and profitable bestows a kind of moral power to financiers, legitimizing both their social vision and their methods of capital accumulation. So I'd like to take a historical detour and elaborate with two examples before returning to contemporary social finance. In September of 1781, a British slave ship, the Zong, left the coast of Africa for Jamaica with 470 slaves. Like many captains, Luke Collingwood took on as many slaves as possible in order to increase the profitability of his voyage. But this was Collingwood's first trip as captain. He normally served as the ship's physician. He overestimated the number of slaves he should have taken on, and due to a lack of wind, the Zong became stranded temporarily in the middle of the Atlantic. As the ship sat idle, disease began to spread, brought on by overcrowding and unsanitary conditions. After 7 crew members and 60 slaves died, Collingwood decided to jettison or throw overboard 132 slaves in order to ease the overcrowding. While in some circumstances the loss of more than 1/3 of a slave ship's cargo might have been disastrous, the Zong's owners had the foresight to insure their human cargo, ensuring that the voyage would be profitable regardless of whether or not the enslaved survived their voyage. Maritime insurance was a newly popular innovation because during the era of the American Revolution, transatlantic voyages became much more dangerous. And eventually, the winds picked back up and the Zong made it to Jamaica, and the owners promptly filed a claim for the value of the cargo that they had lost. The owners argued that the murder of more than 100 men and women was necessary because of a water shortage. The insurance underwriter challenged the owner's story based on the fact that there was in fact a surplus of water aboard the Zong when it landed in Jamaica. But despite their dubious reasoning, the Zong's owners won their case. But the insurance underwriter appealed, and by this time the case had caught the attention of prominent British abolitionists. And it just so happened that the Lord Chief Justice of the British Judiciary, who heard the appeal, was sympathetic to the abolitionists. He reversed the decision, and the Zong's owners were ultimately not compensated for their lost slaves. Yet they very easily could have been, and neither the owners nor Collingwood, the captain, were subject to any criminal charges because, of course, they'd committed no crime against anyone legally defined as a person. So if you take a look at the image up here, you might be forgiven if you assume that it's the Zong, but it's actually a depiction of Brazil. This woodcut appeared in the Liberator, which is an American abolitionist newspaper. It appeared in 1832, and there's just a brief caption under it that says that this is a depiction of slaves being thrown overboard in the port of Rio, so the owners wouldn't have to pay import duties on slaves who ultimately could not be sold. And so again, there's no way of really verifying whether or not this actually happened. 19th century newspapers don't cite sources, and it's oftentimes very unclear where any given article comes from if there's not a byline under it. But this at least shows, even though the Zong case didn't result in compensation, the idea that you could kill or throw slaves overboard in order to reduce financial risk or increase your profit margin was very much an idea that was circulating during this time period. The Zong Massacre punctuates the potential violence embedded in racialized financial innovations. The market for slaves in the Americas radically reoriented the British economy and produced the need for finance-based structures of capital, such as credit, insurance, stocks, and bonds. Stocks related to the foreign trade, and the slave trade specifically, came to dominate the British market over the course of the 18th century. So it's important to remember that in filing an insurance claim for slaves thrown overboard, the owners of the Zong weren't just taking advantage of an existing loophole in an old, well-used financial tool. The slave trade itself was a primary motivator leading to the development of robust insurance networks. Now, there's certainly something unique about the spectacular brutality of the Zong Massacre. It's not as if ship captains were throwing hundreds of slaves overboard daily. But what's less unique is the way that maritime slave insurance allowed slave traders to hedge against the infrequent but potentially disastrous interruptions of their profits. Such innovations show us that slavery didn't only create wealth by compelling physical labor from enslaved people, but it also created wealth by innovating ever more creative ways of extracting value from black bodies. Take, for example, the Consolidated Association of the Planters of Louisiana, or the CAPL, formed in 1827. And I'm drawing here from the research of Ed Baptist on the CAPL, who's a historian at Cornell. Despite its name, the CAPL was actually a bank, and like all banks, it engaged in lending and offering credit. But it also came up with new financial tools to allow planters to leverage the value of their slaves at very little risk, either to themselves or to the bank's other investors. The clients of the CAPL, the borrowers, were planters themselves, but they were also the owners. Planters would mortgage their slaves to the bank and receive certificates of stock in exchange. Planters could then borrow half the value of their stock, which was paid out in CAPL banknotes. So basically, a bunch of rich planters got together, decided to form a bank underwritten by the massive value of their slaves, bought stock into it, and then borrowed from said bank, of which they collectively owned. So this was, of course, a totally closed circular system that would serve absolutely no purpose unless those CAPL banknotes had actual liquid capital backing them. So the board of directors used their influence as powerful slave owners to strong-arm the state of Louisiana into backing $2.5 million worth of CAPL bonds. These bonds would have terms of 10 to 15 years and would offer investors a 5% return. The CAPL then worked with the famous London financier Thomas Baring to sell those bonds on the international securities market. The bonds were easy to sell for two reasons. First, Baring convinced investors that the CAPL was bound to make a profit from the interest it would accrue from its loans to planters. Slavery was big business, and so it was sort of difficult to go wrong loaning to planters. And second, the CAPL's deal with the state of Louisiana meant that Louisiana taxpayers would be responsible for the CAPL's debts should the bank ever default, as unlikely as that might have been. So Baring was able to present the CAPL bonds as essentially a risk-free investment. These bonds allowed planters unprecedented financial flexibility, since the CAPL redistributed risk from its planter investors to the citizens of Louisiana. Because planters were both borrowers and lenders, they could borrow money at artificially low rates and be reasonably certain that the borrowed money would produce a much higher rate of return than the interest of their debt. In effect, human property could now enrich slave owners with two types of revenue: the result of physical labor in the form of commodities like cotton or sugar, and also by leveraging them on the financial market for additional credit. CAPL bonds benefited planters, of course, but they also implicated a wide variety of actors in the financialization of slavery. European investors could enjoy the profits of slavery without dealing with messy ethical questions about owning actual slaves. They could also reap the financial benefits of slave ownership without the risk, since unlike a human being, a bond could not run away, die, or become rebellious. With the CAPL, planters had found a way to securitize human life. Because of their legal status as non-persons, the enslaved were ideal subjects of experimentation for new financial innovations. As we can see from the examples of the Zong and the CAPL, through a process of financialization, enslaved people could be transformed from subjects excluded from all market activity into mitigators of risk absolutely essential to the functioning of markets. And yet, because they were objects of experimentation rather than innovators, the central role of enslaved people in the history of finance often remains obscured. So with these earlier examples of racial finance in mind, I want to return to social impact bonds. At first glance, SIBs might look like the complete opposite of the CAPL. The CAPL leveraged Black suffering to transfer risk away from planter investors and toward the public, whereas SIBs work to lessen the suffering of the disadvantaged and transfer risk away from the public and toward private investors. But it's actually not so clear-cut. The profit model of SIBs is predicated on the assumption of risk, the idea that private investors deserve their payday because, unlike government, they have the vision to produce innovative solutions to trenchant problems that carry some element of economic uncertainty. But private investors wouldn't be in the position of being able to invest in anything if they took undue risk with their money. And based on preliminary evaluations of existing SIB contracts, it's not clear at all that any risk is actually being transferred. The legal negotiations for these bonds are complex, and many of the details aren't publicly available. But we do know that it often takes years for state agencies to complete contracts with private investors, and lenders with well-funded legal teams are unlikely to expose themselves to significant risk. For example, in the Rikers Island prison recidivism bond, one of the principal investors, Goldman Sachs, negotiated extra protections to eliminate nearly all risk from the project. Furthermore, the cost of risk mitigation, project design, legal negotiations, intermediaries, evaluators, service providers, and investor premiums often means that any increased efficiency doesn't actually translate into savings for government. For example, a Massachusetts prison recidivism bond will pay about $22 million to its investors if the program succeeds. That's roughly the same amount that the state is projected to save from reduced rates of reincarceration. So while so far some SIBs have been more successful and some less, on the whole, there's little evidence that they're anything more than the transfer of public wealth into private hands. With dwindling resources for social services, it's not much of a surprise that cities and states would be eager for any new potential sources of funding, and they'd want to take advantage of them. But I think we also have to consider that the intertwined history of race and finance has made populations of color seem uniquely investable, a kind of laboratory for inventing new opportunities for capital accumulation. There's been great interest in the issues of prison recidivism. In the US, Black people make up about 40% of the incarcerated population, but only 13% of the general population. And in the UK, the disparity is even worse. Black people make up about 3% of the population, but 34% of the inmates. And I'd argue that it's precisely this racial disparity in incarceration, in homelessness, in education, that makes these areas so attractive for experimenting with the viability of new forms of investing and profit-making. At its worst, social finance causes us to misdiagnose the causes of inequality. They offer apolitical solutions to problems their investors might be deeply complicit in. Take the example of the Ventura County project to support reentry, a new social impact bond and the subject of Cameron's piece here at the Biennial. So Ventura is in Southern California between LA and San Diego, and the purpose of this bond is to reduce recidivism in an attempt to ease overcrowding in the county jails. Unlike other SIBs focused on recidivism, the Ventura County project has explicitly stated that it will rely on something called moral reconation therapy to keep young people out of jail. Moral reconation therapy, or MRT, is a cognitive behavioral treatment system that leads to enhanced moral reasoning, better decision-making, and more appropriate behavior. This is according to their own website. Proponents of MRT claim that it's an especially effective method of treating criminogenic thinking or antisocial behavior in populations of color. So the real shift that's going on here is not one of risk, but of responsibility. We're asked to think of criminal behavior as the result of individual moral choices rather than the result of policies that produce displacement, inequality, and precariousness. The deficiencies inherent in blackness itself come to be the problem, not the conditions that make criminal behavior seem like an effective survival strategy for people. So I think we can say that finance no longer presides over racialized death, as in slavery, but rather it administers racial life, reconfiguring the most vulnerable populations as potential profit, supposedly for social good. The Ventura SIB shows that the metrics of success for social finance instruments have the potential to become tools for making the behavior and lifestyle of targeted populations accountable to investor expectations. The innovations of social finance make inequality profitable and obscure its root causes. They also make populations generally considered unproductive profitable in new ways. An incarcerated person can generate profit by helping to fill a quota in a private prison, by working on a production line in a state or federal prison, and now even by successfully transitioning into post-prison life. Every aspect of your contact with the carceral system, from your entrance to your exit, has the potential to be financialized. So by way of conclusion, I'll just reiterate that financial instruments have long articulated with the devaluation of racialized life. Race has been a tool with which financial innovators shift or elide ethical concerns raised by their financial practices across different historical contexts. In search of new horizons of capital accumulation, self-styled ethical investors are increasingly searching for new ways to transform racialized populations into a winning bet. Instead of abandoning these populations, investors incorporate them into financial systems that invent new ways to generate capital returns. While current social institutions are largely organized to relegate such subjects to the margins of social life, the philanthrocapitalist sector implements social finance tools such as SIBs to reintegrate the lives of the excluded in novel ways to make them more financially productive. They promise to improve such subjects by overcoming their risky behavior through carefully engineered social programming. The real innovation is not so much in the programming itself, but finding perpetually new ways to transfer wealth away from the public sector in the name of public good. Yet to accept such logic is to ignore how the conditions that make finance so profitable in the first place, deregulation, scaled back labor rights, disinvestment in state-sponsored welfare programs, are the very same conditions that cause and exacerbate the forms of dislocation finance now proposes to fix. Just as planters in antebellum Louisiana could benefit from the social conditions of slavery twice over, first by putting their human property to work on plantations, and again by collateralizing it to increase their access to credit, so too do contemporary financiers benefit twice from the conditions of contemporary capitalism. They profit by solving the very social problems they've benefited from creating. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Justin. I'm Sasha. And I'm really thankful that I'm here to hear that. And I wanted to ask you about the movie 13th, which is pretty much about that, and which is really great that it's public for everyone to see. And it was, for me, quite amazing to see how prisoners are slaves nowadays. Were you somehow connected to this production at all? Or?
No.
What do you think about it? What do you think about it?
So I think it's really useful in a lot of ways, and I think it gives us access to some dynamics that you'd normally have to read about or go much more out of your way to learn about. So I think there's a lot of positive aspects of it, but I also have some colleagues who are much more knowledgeable about the condition of contemporary prisons that have some big critiques of it. And I think the biggest one is that it puts so much emphasis on private prisons when that's actually a very small percentage of the total incarcerated population. The one exception is that immigration detention centers are overwhelmingly private, but for the most part, private prisons only make up a very small percentage of the total prison system. And so I think the film kind of wants us to think that maybe that's the direction to go in terms of addressing prisons, but it's important to remember that it's still very much a public institution. And specifically, Dan Berger and Ruthie Gilmore have really great critiques. If you, they can say it much more eloquently than I could.
Hi, thanks. On? Cool. It's interesting to me to hear you say that the development of a lot of the SIBs dovetailed with the 2008 financial crisis. And I'm wondering, I'm an artist and I used to work a lot with social practice, and I've since kind of transitioned away from that, from some feelings that seem awfully similar to what you've described as essentially banking on the problems that organizations have no intention of solving. And I'm wondering if you've done any research, or maybe your colleagues doing more contemporary research can talk about maybe why this came at 2008 and what was going on before, or if there were trends that led this to happen, and also whether you're interested in thinking about art and contemporary art in any of these valences, because I think that there's some registers that have resonance there. Thanks.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the most straightforward part of the answer is that after the 2008 crisis, it seemed like for the first time in several decades that there was this crack in kind of economic system that everyone had basically told themselves was working great, unless, of course, it wasn't working great for you. And so it sort of provided an opening, and I think it probably scared a lot of people and got them thinking, what is the way of repairing this system without really giving any substantive concessions, but kind of changing the optics of it. And yeah, so I think kind of trying to turn people away from questioning capitalism as a whole and kind of working more toward rehabilitating it in some way is where that intersection of social finance and the financial crisis comes in. I'm not sure if I have anything super insightful to say about art, except I have to say I really loved the piece on debt downstairs or upstairs. So if you haven't checked it out, I would encourage you to, because it's really phenomenal.
Hi, Justin.
Hi, Anju.
It was a beautiful talk, and I really cannot wait to read your book. You said a couple of times that there is a kind of experimentation happening, right, on Black populations in particular. And I wondered if, so much of the story that you're telling in this project and in the book is particularly about the afterlives of slavery, so the particular legal construction or non-legal construction of Black personhood or non-Black personhood, right? But you're also, in a way, I guess I'm wondering, is this zone of experimentation or this sort of crucible or laboratory in which these financial instruments are being developed, does that imply for you a possible transition or growth out of that population? In other words, we develop these tools by thinking about this like most abject population, which is the Black American population, and then let's see them work for women, right, for disabled people, is that part of what you're thinking about in the book, or is there something really specific about the afterlife of slavery in particular that focuses your study?
No, I absolutely think that it's something that becomes transferable. Michael Ralph at NYU has made the argument that slave insurance is sort of an important antecedent for thinking about life insurance. So actually all of us, or many of us, have lives that are precisely valued to someone. I think also, if you think about in earlier history, the Chinese and Indian migration through coolie contracts, or even indigenous slavery in California and the Western United States that happened after the emancipation or the abolition of African slavery, clearly contain traces of this dynamic, right? I think as we move forward in time, tools that become developed specifically for the purpose of making slavery profitable actually become expanded. And it's important to think about, that's sort of why I began with emancipation and the quotation from James Mccune Smith. And I think he's asking us, instead of thinking about emancipation as bringing slaves up to the level of freedom that white people enjoyed, maybe we can think about emancipation as bringing all people, including white people, down to somewhere closer to slavery if it's not about the expansion of more robust forms of freedom.
Thanks so much for your talk. Thanks for coming. So I think you've made a really compelling argument about some of the flaws of the SIBs. And I was wondering what you maybe saw as potential alternative methods or solutions to some of the social problems you mentioned.
Yeah, that's obviously a really good question. I mean, I think, so maybe you've had a debate with someone, you pass by a homeless person on the street, and you think about giving them money, but you're maybe worried that they're gonna buy drugs or alcohol with the money you give them. And I think in a lot of ways that's a totally legitimate concern, but instead of kind of thinking about what we do for disadvantaged people as a form of charity that's subject to kind of some sort of standard that we set based on our own moral universe, what if we instead just sort of thought it as wealth redistribution on a very minor scale and said that actually it's sort of my responsibility to give whatever I have in my pocket to these other people, and it doesn't really matter what they do with it. I think in some ways it's a little bit difficult to scale that up because of course, corporations and philanthropies have much more complex structures than our own kind of inner world. But there is something I saw the other day, and I'm forgetting the name. It's something very grandiose, like changetheworld.com. But the idea is that a group of people could basically apply to get a sum of $15,000 to organize their community, and if they could kind of show that they had done something useful, the sponsors would work with them to get more money. And I sort of spent a good deal of time on the site and tried to get a sense of what they were doing, and it really, as someone who's normally very skeptical of that kind of thing, it did seem, I was taken in by it, and I thought, maybe this is actually an interesting model, kind of no strings money to do things in your community and really relying on local people's knowledge. And I think, for example, like the disability rights movement or the trans rights movement have been really great in terms of centering affected people in terms of determining organizing strategy. And I think it's also probably no coincidence that those are less well-funded social justice movements that can't necessarily attract the same kinds of big money that others can. So I think, unfortunately, there's sort of a negative correlation between funding sources and giving autonomy to people who are affected by issues, but I think that would be the place to start, trying to reverse that dynamic.
Justin, please use the mic. Sorry.
Oh, sorry.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I always learn so much from you and your language. My question, obviously you had me thinking a lot about Spillers and Hartman, and I'm thinking about your conversation, your talk about really race finance, and I'm thinking about how an attention to gender and sexuality might inform this. Thinking specifically about obviously Mama's Baby and kind of Black women's womb as being an original site of capitalist accumulation. So how might just an attention to gender and I think also sexual violence inform how we're thinking about, I would say, finance today?
Yeah, so I think the first place where you see this idea of slaves being profitable in two ways is the reproductive labor of enslaved women. And it's actually when Jefferson notes that he is making a profit from his female slaves reproducing at a higher rate, that he starts to back away from openly supporting emancipation. And he then sort of, finds ways of kind of expanding that increased profitability beyond just enslaved women, right? He sort of trains young slaves to be artisans so he can use free labor to do all sorts of projects, and he doesn't have to pay anyone. He, uses slaves to cover his debts so he can leave a bigger inheritance to his white children. And I think even though I didn't say that explicitly here, I think women's reproductive labor is really at the heart of this financialization or kind of duality of enslaved labor. In terms of how it functions today, so I mostly talked about prison recidivism SIBs in the US and the UK, and they have also far been focused on young men. But of course we know that a lot of microfinance schemes in the global South target overwhelmingly it's women who they loan to rather than men. And there have been some kind of disastrous results with mass suicides among people who can't repay their loans. But I think there's this kind of gendered idea that women are more responsible or kind of better at managing household incomes and finances, and so they are the people to lend to, and so that's where we can see a very gendered dynamic in these schemes. Less so the SIBs of the global north, but more the kind of, they're called development investment bonds when they're done internationally. I think that's where you see women targeted a lot more.
I just want to say thank you, but this was more so a question that's following up on the young women's statement about sort of transferring the SIBs and their programs into, gender and disability. And it just made me think that SIBs are in essence more problematic if they're just continuing this cycle of just poverty and just black male incarceration in the States and in the UK. So what's the real point of SIBs if the money's there and it could just go towards, stopping, I guess the social, at its root, it's the social issues that are causing these problems instead of, okay, let's stop someone halfway and then they might not even get out of jail. Do you get what I'm trying to say?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's probably a few things going on in terms of what the motivation behind this is. I do think probably the people who are involved genuinely have concerns about a variety of social issues. I think, however, they probably are very reluctant to think about how, whether they personally or the organization they work for or their sort of demographic population, they're probably hesitant to think about how they are implicated in the creation of that problem. And so that leads to a narrowing of the range of solutions that you can come up with. I think also, even if they genuinely want to solve social problems, they also truly believe that finance culture is better equipped to create solutions based on, its innovativeness, its efficiency, its sort of successes in getting rich, basically. And so they're predisposed to kind of using those tools to solve all problems, whether or not it's the most appropriate one or not. Does that answer your question? So there's a hand down here.
Okay. Oh, up here real quick. Sorry. So three things, and you can just pick one, and you don't have whatever feels right to you. But one thing that jumped out to me was the ability to turn an endeavor into a guaranteed profit, and not to link this as directly connected, but just kind of that strategy is expanding, right? I mean, so thinking about Promesa in Puerto Rico, thinking about federal student loans where essentially an individual is not allowed to bankrupt out of them. And so you're creating these investments that are forced returns. So I'm just curious your thoughts on that strategy expanding of like a forced guarantee return. And then if you're interested, you don't have to take this on, but I'm just curious your thoughts on universal basic incomes and on reparations. Sorry, just curious.
So maybe the first one, I think actually the idea that investors take significant risks, I don't have sort of a citation off the top of my head to back this up, but I would guess that that's a little bit more myth than reality. And certainly you can kind of, if you have a retirement fund or something, you can say it goes into more risky versus less risky funds. But in terms of these big kind of instruments like, debt in countries in the global south, like this massive student healthcare, this massive student loan bubble. I mean, those big things are ones that I don't think there actually is much risk to the lender, as you say. So I guess my answer is just to say that I think risk is probably fairly absent from a lot of these major transnational kind of investing and financial practices. Whether or not that is really directly related to some of the things that we've talked about tonight, I'd have to think about a little bit more. Universal basic income, yeah. I know I've read some critiques, like left critiques of it, but they're not coming to mind. And I say, why not try it, right? Reparations, I feel somewhat frustrated with a lot of the reparations discourse, and I maybe shouldn't admit publicly, but I didn't love the Coates article on it. But I do think that to actually address any kind of social problem on a large scale, you do need to think of it as a responsibility, whether it's kind of one with a long history or a shorter history. I don't think you can be successful thinking about something as philanthropic or just charitable. It's always sort of about the kind of debts we actually owe to other people. I mean, it's a pretty young audience here, so if you're living in Manhattan or Brooklyn or parts of Queens or the Bronx and you haven't been living there for more than 40 years, then we've all benefited from the massive displacement that's going on. And that doesn't mean we all have to leave our houses, but it does mean we have to kind of think about what we owe to communities that are no longer there, even if it's a very difficult question. I don't have an easy answer, but I think that's sort of the frame of mind we need to be in. So yes on reparations, but maybe not just sort of a check for $12 billion or whatever the amount would be. I think the point is that the sum is incalculable, right? And so reparations is almost too small a framework for thinking about what it would mean to kind of produce justice for the formerly enslaved.
Hello, thank you. I'm a new school student, so I'm really happy to see you here today. I'm reading parts of The Black Atlantic by Paul Gilroy. So you're familiar with it, yeah. And they talk a lot about abolishing race as a construct. But what does this mean for racial capitalism? Because you can't take race out of racial capitalism, and how can we abolish racial capitalism, or what does it mean? How do we overcome it? What are the steps that people of color folk can take so that way we can overcome it? Because when spaces like the Whitney come out with certain pieces of work that just are a bit problematic, I think that it gains a sort of social capital for the Whitney, and I just don't know how to feel about that sometimes.
Yeah. So The Black Atlantic came out in 1992 or 1993, and so it was very much of a moment where kind of people were just starting to discuss race as a social construct, and it seemed as though that kind of after discovering it was a construct, the path to liberation might be to abolish it. And I think for the most part, the scholarship has built on that idea, but has left the idea of abolishing race behind, and sort of maybe has settled more on something that is about acknowledging racial difference and racial violence and not shying away from it. What is to be done? I mean, I think after reading so many kind of responses, I confused myself a little bit, but I do think that the problem, we know that race isn't super discrete and super kind of real, and in that sense, I think it becomes really tough to stand behind an argument that is based on, only black people can make art about blackness. But I think where the problematic aspect comes in is when non-black artists benefit disproportionately from the production of their art, and take space away from all of the amazing black artists that are being exhibited. And that's the dynamic that I'm kind of more interested in, not the question of can non-black people effectively write or create about blackness? Because I think the answer is yes, but it's about how they do it, and what particular rewards they get for it that black people do not always get.
I think we have one more question.
Hi, this is probably a terrible question to end on, but thinking about when you said, like, unlike a human being, a bond cannot run away, but then thinking about how the social impact bonds have these, they're like fixed terms, and they end, and that how both slavery and capitalism share a quality of like a fictitious but violently enforced permanence, right? Both could be escaped, but it's made incredibly difficult to do. And then thinking again, also as you referenced with the financialization of poor people's debts in the global South, and how those programs and other forms of philanthropy leave behind them, like they are there for a fixed term and then leave behind a lot of violence and continued poverty. So just thinking about this, I guess my question is about scales of time and senses of permanence.
Yeah, I think one of the things that happens when we abandon history is we sort of imagine that poor places were always poor and rich places were always rich. And I think the other kind of consequence of this philanthropic mindset is, again, the idea that places, say, with immense mineral resources are actually poor places, right? They're not, but there is a kind of global economic structure made up of trade deals that extracts those kinds of resources in a way that does not proportionally benefit the country they're coming from. And so then we haven't this idea that by offering loans or by offering aid, it's doing morally the right thing, and forget that the production of poverty and wealth is ongoing, and it's not kind of something that happened in the past or has always been that way. It's sort of has to be constantly maintained. And by just thinking about aid as unidirectional and kind of doing the right thing and trying your best to help someone or some place that is probably never going to pull themselves up and get out of poverty, but you're doing everything you can, is precisely the wrong way of thinking about it. So I think we need to be open to kind of new ways about thinking of time and continuity in history. Thank you all.